I just want to say thank you for coming along to the meeting. Thank you for the Royal Society of Biology for inviting me. I kind of recognise that a lot of us will have had a rather hot and restless night and might be feeling a little bit weary. So I'll try and keep the pace of the meeting lively for us all. But it really is a privilege for me to share Mary Wortley Montagu's story. She's such an inspirational, outspoken woman who pushed the boundaries of social convention to introduce the practice of preventative medicine into Britain, saving countless lives. And we feel the benefit of that today with COVID vaccinations, of course. And she faced up to a huge amount of skepticism from many, and she never lived to see the success of her undertaking. And in fact, she regretted her involvement with it. She did not know what was going to come, but we do, of course. So my aim in this talk is to consider what it was about Mary, her personality, her social position, the times in which she lived, and her timing, which enabled her to become a medical pioneer in the face of the many barriers that stood in her way, and to remember and recognise her contribution to medicine. Now, I'm not much of a technical person, but I'm now going to put my PowerPoint up, so bear with me, and it should be fine. There we go. The Right Honourable Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who in 1720, wrong date, 1721 it should be, introduced inoculation of the smallpox into England from Turkey. And I've got to say, this inscription, it really took me back because all I really remembered about smallpox from school is that it all started with Edward Jenner and vaccination. So I was really intrigued to find out what this woman's involvement was with it 75 years earlier. And of course, it mentioned Turkey, and this tale promised to involve like foreign travel, which interested me. And I've got to say, when I was standing in front of the monument, I thought, have I actually ever really seen a monument to a woman this old before? And I came to realise that this is the first dedication of a monument to the social and intellectual achievement of a woman in Britain. So it's really quite significant in garden and monument history as well. So I started doing my research about Mary, and then when the National Trust took over custodianship of Wentworth Castle Gardens 3 years ago, I became a volunteer with the intent purpose to tell visitors about Mary's story, and I carried on doing my research. And I find, like myself, when I first read the inscription, people are really fascinated in her and her story. It really makes them stop and think. Okay. Okay, now before I really crack on and tell you about Mary, I feel I need to take a sidestep and have a look at the horrors of smallpox and what it meant for people living in the early 18th century. Now, I haven't chosen my most gruesome slides, but instead, if we start with this screen on the left-hand side, where you can see 4 images of a young man with smallpox. So if you were unfortunate to have smallpox, you'd start with a fever, a high fever, a backache, headache. You really would feel absolutely dreadful. But you wouldn't know that you had smallpox at this stage. And about 2 days later, you'd start getting spots inside your mouth and on your face. And within 24 hours, you could have up to 10,000 pustules. You can see on this lady's back how it could cover the whole body, but mainly tracks the hot parts of your body, your face, inside your mouth, behind your eyes, your sexual organs, really, really horrific. So these spots would turn into fluid-filled pustules. that pustule would become opaque, your fever would return, and you would be itchy beyond belief to the point of delirium. This is like the crisis point in your illness. If you were lucky enough to get through that stage, scabs would form from your pustules, and then they would eventually fall off and leave you with white pits and scarring. So during the early 18th century, 1 in 4 died of smallpox. You were more vulnerable if you were an infant, a pregnant woman, or anyone who was elderly, which meant over 40 in the early 18th century. It also caused 30% of blindness, terrible disfiguring, which was especially difficult for women who were, valued for their beauty. It was endemic in Western Europe, especially in cities where always new children being born to become its victim, and it would erupt into frequent epidemics. It was also known to be a universal disease. Almost everybody got smallpox at some time in their life, and this led to a widespread fear of it. There were sayings like, don't count your children until they've had smallpox, or one child who's had smallpox is worth 2 that have it to come, a huge amount of fear. And it was no respecter of class. It affected kings and queens of Europe as much as it did the poor, and it killed off quite a few monarchies, including the Stuart monarchy in Britain. The causes of smallpox were not known. Of course, now we know it's caused by the variola virus, but that itself wasn't identified till the development of the electron microscope in the 1930s. They had a vague idea about contagion, but it wasn't really fully understood. In the early 18th century, we're still living in the era of miasmas, the idea that a noxious smell would carry this disease on, and smallpox was apparently terribly smelly. You wouldn't want to go near someone who had it. In terms of treatment, to be honest, you were better off being poor. All you really needed was care and attention, food, water, someone to look after you who'd not had smallpox, because it's very infectious. But if you were lucky enough to be rich, you'd be unlucky enough to be treated by a physician. We are in the age of humoral medicine. Smallpox is seen to be a kind of fermenting illness, and by giving you vomits, purgatives, letting your blood, making you hot, or making you cold, depending on the physician you had, your physician would hope to rebalance your humours and bring you back to good health. There is no concept of one cure fits all. But there was something significant that happened in 1714, and that is that the Royal Society received a letter from a well-respected medic called Emmanuel Timoney, who described how there was a folklore practice in Turkey which prevented death from smallpox. Now, the Royal Society take an interest. They asked for further information, but they're very conservative institution at this point. Evidence is disregarded if it did not fit into the theoretical framework of the practice of the day, that is humoral medicine. In fact, if you provided experience, we don't really use the word evidence at this point, you would be called an empiric, and you were kind of beyond contempt, really. It didn't matter if you could prove what it did. If it didn't fit into the theories, it was disregarded. So Turkish inoculation is discussed, but anyone can discuss something. No medic was prepared to stake their reputation and their income to actually attempt to inoculate. And that could have been the end of the story for inoculation. But no, what was needed was a different approach. So enter Mary Wortley Montagu. So what I'm going to look at now is certain episodes in Mary's life that really cut her out to be a pioneer. Let's have a sip of water. So Mary is born Mary Pierpoint in 1689, and I've got to tell you folks, she was posh. Look at her house. This is Thoresby Hall. This isn't the original building that Mary lived in, that burnt down, but you can see the scale of the property. And her dad was Duke of Kingston, and certainly her position in life was going to give her the opportunity to mix with politicians, clerics, lawyers, doctors, but her education was very much down to the whims of her father. And now her father wanted to educate her as a marriage prospect. So what was important then was, to him, was a woman was educated to be a wife, a mother, head of a large household, and a kind of refining presence at her husband's side. But this was not for Mary. Mary wrote that nobody's really interested in what she got up to at Thoresby Hall, and she used to spend 8 hours a day in the library there, and there she taught herself to speak and read Latin, which is a very difficult language to learn. I think this is very interesting, that she used to read classic literature and she used to rewrite it from the heroine's point of view, the woman's point of view. And I think the fact that she was a self-educator, it meant that she wasn't tramlined into thinking a certain way. She thought about things her way. She could see things from a different side. And Mary was very aware that she didn't have a right to be educated. She described herself as stealing her education. And women at this time were banned from university and banned from professions. But Mary did start to write. She started to write diaries, poems, prose, letters. She used to correspond with the local bishop from the age of 13, and apparently she could hold her own in an argument. So I'm just going to go to the next slide now. So we have an independent-minded, self-educated woman, but the time has come for Mary to get married. Now, again, this is down to her father's choice, and her father chose the exotically named Clotworthy Skeffington, who was an Irish peer. But Mary wanted to make her own choice. She'd met Edward Montagu on the left here. She was friends with his sister, who died of smallpox, by the way, and they carried on corresponding. Now, it wasn't a love match, but she felt that intellectually they were equal. Now, I think Edward, he really admired Mary, but if you get a chance to read the letters between them, it's uncomfortable reading. You want to say, Mary, don't do it, because everything that was wonderful about Mary, her wit, her intellect, her beauty, Edward did not want her to share with anybody else. He wanted to kind of lock her away. And so it was a difficult situation for her. Anyway, she elopes, and this is a very reckless thing to do. She does it the night before she's due to be married to Clotworthy Skeffington, and Mary is going to be reliant on the finances of her father, her husband, and she has a younger brother as well who dies of smallpox the year later. She's really letting herself be quite vulnerable. She knows what she doesn't want, and she will do anything to do what she wants to do. And I think this is something quite important in her story of introducing inoculation as well. So a year after her marriage, she has a young child, also called Edward Wortley Montagu. And Edward, who's an MP, by the way, and a coal mine owner, gets a job in the Treasury. The whole family decamp to London. It's 1714. George I has just acceded to the throne, the first of the Hanoverians, and Mary joins the royal court. And this is where she really comes into her own. She starts meeting writers, musicians, all the high and mighty, all the literate people in London. and she meets her great friend, at that time anyway, Alexander Pope, and they start to write together. Mary really does identify as a writer throughout her life. Now, the way people wrote in those days is they write anonymously, and they would often write with somebody else, and they'd write quite satirical works, often quite scandalous. And Mary writes a piece apparently about the Princess of Wales, and there's a huge amount of scandal of it. She faces being ostracized from the court, but something happens then that changes the course of her life. She contracts smallpox. Now, there's an image here which completely contradicts the text here. This is meant to be Mary with smallpox, looking very serene and rather beautiful, maybe a little tired. But if I read you the text, it says, she tossed in her elegant bed, gasping for air, her fever, I can't read that bit, splattered with a shotgun pattern of deep surrusting pustules, suppurating pustules, and itchy, inflamed delirium. Her physicians told her husband to fear the worst. So she's really very, very ill as well. She has lots of pustules. She has confluent smallpox, so they're joined together on her face. And when she does survive, she's badly scarred. She loses her eyelashes, which were apparently a real feature of her beauty and wit, her beauty at court. And she also finds it difficult being in bright light for the rest of her life. So she has now got experience of smallpox and how it can affect her life. She's lost her brother. She's lost her looks. Then a twist of fate. Apparently, Edward Wortley Montagu isn't doing too well at the Treasury. He's not really liked. They want to sort of move him away from the centre of power. And he gets appointed to be ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. And Mary has always had a lust for travel. And she really comes into element preparing for this trip abroad, which is meant to be for 5 years. So she arranges a retinue of servants, including a cleric and her surgeon, Charles Maitland, and her toddler son, Edward. They all travel across Europe. They encounter bubonic plague in Hungary, battlefields in the Ottoman Empire, and they arrive in Turkey. Now, Mary really is the consummate travel correspondent. She's very open-minded. She's incredibly curious. She's a linguist. She learns to speak Arabic. She learns to speak Turkish. And she keeps a daily diary for the whole of her life. And she writes to all her contacts in Britain, describing life on the road and in Turkey. And one of the things she really wants to do is she wants to find out how elite women like her live in the East. And one of the things she does is she visits a Turkish bathhouse, which is the image you can see in front of you now. And in the steamy atmosphere with lots of naked women there, she notices that none of them have scarring like her. And she asks a very important question. She says, I see you don't have smallpox in Turkey. And they say, oh yes, we do have smallpox in Turkey, but nobody dies of it because we have a way of controlling it. Now, this must have sounded miraculous to Mary. She's had smallpox. Her life has been affected of it. She knows the fear that Britons live in of this horrific disease, and she makes it her business to find out what it is that the Turks do. She's invited to an inoculation party, and she describes this party in a very famous letter called Letter to Sarah Chiswell. I'm going to read a bit about it, and then I'm going to attempt to go back to the image of me and do a demonstration of Turkish inoculation technique. So just a moment. Right, so Mary describes what the Turks do. She says that every autumn when the heat is abated, that's important, the Turks are choosing a cool time. People make parties together of about 16 or so children who have a mind to have smallpox. An old woman comes with a nutshell. Right, one moment, this is where my demonstration comes in. Can you see me? Can I be made big or not? I don't know if I can. Anyway, so a woman, usually a Greek or Armenian old woman, goes out with a nutshell, a walnut shell, in fact, and she finds someone who has the best type of smallpox. Now, that means someone who has less than 100 pustules on their body, and she collects the pus in the walnut shell. She then seals it together, nice tight seal. She actually pops it in her cleavage, to, I guess, to keep it at body temperature, and she brings it back to the party. And then Mary goes on to describe how the woman takes a needle, a long needle, and puts as much pus on it as fits on the end of a needle. Now, I know that's not a measured amount, but you can imagine. Oh, this is Dijon mustard, by the way, is the pus. And then she asks the inoculee which vein they want to have ripped open. That's not as bad as it sounds. It's actually a scratch, she describes, and then scratches them with it. So it just breaks the skin. And then a piece of nut, I don't know if you can see that walnut, is put over the wounds. And the children, about 8 days later, get a fever, take to their beds. They get about 20 or 30 pustules. They carry on playing, they feel fine, and the pustules go. They're not scarred at all, and they have lifelong immunity. Gosh, I don't think I mentioned that when I was talking about smallpox. One thing everybody knew is you could only get smallpox once. So these Turkish children, they've had smallpox, they've survived, they're never going to get it again. So Mary writes, I'm going to go back to share screen now, I think. Hang on a moment. Right, we're back. So she says that every year thousands go through this operation. There is no example that anyone has died of it, and you may believe that I am very well satisfied of the safety of this experiment, and I intended to try it on my own dear son. And then this is the crucial line. She says, I am patriot enough to bring this useful invention into fashion in England. So she makes a commitment. She goes on to say that she doesn't trust any of the doctors to take it up because they'd lose such a big part of their revenue if there wasn't smallpox in Britain. So that's what she thought. Anyway, so Mary goes on to have Edward inoculated. She writes a letter back home, and she describes how she has Edward inoculated by an old woman in a folklore tradition, and her surgeon Charles Maitland, who's there for the whole journey. So he's finding out about Turkish inoculation as well. She writes to say she's not going to have her daughter inoculated because her nurse has not had smallpox. Now this suggests that the Turks understand that smallpox is contagious, which wasn't known in Britain at the time. So, this slide doesn't want to, one moment. This slide does not want to go down. Right, I'm just gonna do something here. Yeah, great, fantastic. Return to England. So Mary has made this commitment to introduce Turkish inoculation to Britain, but she's a very socially aware woman. She's a very pragmatic a woman. She knows that as a woman, if she's seen to introduce a scientific innovation, she won't be listened to, because women at this time are not considered to have the ability to reason as men do. They're not educated to reason. So really she has to use her nous. She sits on her discovery for 3 years. There's an epidemic in London in 1719, but she doesn't have her daughter, Mary, inoculated. She waits until April 1721, and I think there's 2 very good reasons for this. One, there is an epidemic of smallpox in London, and people are far more interested in something that can help that situation if they're in the middle of it. And the other thing that I think is significant is there's smallpox in the royal household. The king's granddaughter, Princess Anne, has smallpox. So what Mary decides to do is she invites Charles Maitland to inoculate her daughter, who's also called Mary, confusingly. Now, Charles Maitland is quite he's quite reluctant. He doesn't want to be seen to be introducing something that doesn't make sense in humoral medicine of the time. But Mary uses all her powers of persuasion and perseverance, and he agrees to inoculate young Mary in front of 3 physicians of the day, which include royal physician Sir Hans Sloane. The inoculation goes well. Towards the end of young Mary's recovery, Mary invites her social contacts, her network, to come and view Mary. I'm assuming this is in rather a kind of large room, because you wouldn't want to go near someone with inoculated smallpox, because they're contagious. So young Mary recovers well, and people start talking about inoculation. It becomes a part of a polite conversation around the dinner table at this stage, if you like. Right, next slide. Another woman comes into this story. Her name is Princess Caroline of Ansbach. She is Princess of Wales. It's her daughter, Anne, who had smallpox. Now, Mary and Caroline get together, and Caroline does not want her other children to contract smallpox. And she knows the king doesn't either, because they're the heirs. After all, the Stuart monarchy died out because of smallpox. So they make a plan to have more experiments. Sir Hans Sloane is kind of in on it. And the plan is to find some expendable people who they can experiment inoculation on. And they choose 6 prisoners from Newgate. Now, the kind of King George is in on this, because he's agreed to offer them a royal pardon if they agree to be inoculated. They're condemned anyway. They're going to die. So in terms of the ethics, it's kind of you're not going to lose out. They're going to die either way, some way, or they might live if inoculation works. The 6 prisoners, 3 men, 3 women, they're all inoculated. They all survive. A few weeks later, one of them is sent to nurse a 13-year-old boy with natural smallpox. She does not contract natural smallpox. So that kind of proves the immune effect of inoculated smallpox prevents against natural smallpox. It's not a huge body of evidence, but it's a step in the right direction. Princess Caroline of Ansbach wants to inoculate her children, but she's not going to take the example of 6 prisoners. They're not like princesses, are they? So next she pays for 6 orphans from Westminster to be inoculated, and they all survive too. She asked Charles Maitland, do you think I should have my daughters inoculated? And he kind of gives a double negative, says, I wouldn't not recommend it. And she has her daughters, Caroline and Amelia, inoculated, and they survive. From going to be a polite dinner table conversation, suddenly a great debate starts. And I've talked about Mary's timing in terms of being in the royal household and epidemic. The other thing that's happening in Britain at the time is the Enlightenment movement. We have the Royal Society with its publication, Philosophical Transactions. The secretary of this organisation puts a call out. He's called James Durin, a call out for anyone who has any knowledge of inoculation to get in touch and tell of their success or otherwise of this procedure. And this leads to a great kind of medical advance, a kind of first in medicine, in that quantitative statistics are used. They go back over the bills of mortality and find out how many people are actually dying of natural smallpox and how many people are reporting of the people they've inoculated dying of that. And they find out that whereas 1 in 4 were dying of natural smallpox, at this stage, in the early days of inoculation, it's about 1 in 60. So there's some evidence. However, some people are very much against smallpox. And I'm just going to read you this quote. There's no full stops in it, so bear with me. They didn't put full stops in sentences, well, only occasionally. So this is from Dr. William Wagstaff, Fellow of the Royal College of Physicians in 1722. And it says, posterity will perhaps scarcely be brought to believe that an experiment practiced by a few ignorant women amongst an illiterate, unthinking people should on slender evidence obtain from the most learned and polite nation in the world ask to be received into the royal palace. So hope you can see in some of that there's real skepticism about Turkish inoculation. For a start, it's practiced by the Turks. You know, people in the East have been seen as other for centuries. They're the old enemy. It's practiced by women. It's practiced in a folklore tradition. It's practiced in a hot climate. This does not fit into the theoretical framework of humoral medicine. So what the medics do is they incorporate inoculation into humoral practice. So now, instead of there being a simple scratch, your physician would give you a big macho cut, go through the skin, the subcutaneous fat, and this is a time when nothing's known about, you know, infection. So quite often the wound site becomes infected, and this can cause death. And of course, you'll be purged, given vomit, put on a preparation that lasts a month of a low diet. So you're weakened, your immune system's weakened before you'd even begin. Right. I want to talk about the reaction to Mary. Where's Mary in all this that's going on? Well, Mary's role at this point is really to network with her friends, to tell them about inoculation. She's called on by almost anyone who's had any weak link to in the past to supervise their inoculations, because that royal endorsement of inoculation caused it to spread like wildfire amongst the nobility of the land. She does get some praise for what she does, but it's a bit nuanced. There's a poem written about her which describes her as having a manly mind. People can't accept that it's a woman's mind who's brought inoculation to Britain. They describe her as being swayed by maternal fondness, not seeing that Mary is actually doing this to save lives of all people, not just children. They describe her as being superior to the turbaned race. So that's that kind of racism coming in again. And this is the worst of the lot. They described her as preserving the beauty of women for the appreciation of their husbands, which is just dreadful. Now, Mary, unfortunately, she regrets her involvement with inoculation on two fronts. One is because the abuse her and her family get. Her granddaughter, writing about Mary, said she seldom passed a day without repenting her patriotic undertaking. She vowed that she would never have attempted it if she had foreseen the vexation and persecution it brought upon her. The common people were taught to hoot at her as an unnatural mother who'd risked the lives of her own children. And although that's terrible, I can kind of understand that she was seen as someone who was giving her children, a dose of a deadly disease, the most feared disease there was at the time. So, so she got quite a lot of abuse. But actually, her regret of introducing inoculation was not to do with that. It was to do the fact that her simple practice that could almost be done by anyone, that didn't require any preparation, who she said nobody died of, was rejected in terms of a complex, costly procedure that was only for the rich. And let me just read you this quote, because I come back to this quote again and again. And this is from Isabel Grundy, who's Mary's main academic biographer. And it said, as a medical innovator, she was locked into interdependence with the professionals. In professionalizing her discovery, they spoilt it. She won the battle, but lost her campaign. The war was won at last, but not in her lifetime. Now, I think there's a bittersweet irony in the fact that Turkish inoculation was not adopted. Now, if it would be, you could argue, well, 1,000 more lives would have been saved. But because the curious minds of the Enlightenment ended up with an imperfect system, this costly, expensive system where quite a few people died, it really spurred them on to really look at inoculation and think, well, could there be a different way? And this period in history, the 75 years that led up to vaccination, saw kind of almost the birth of clinical science, or some of the first clinical scientists, especially someone who you may have heard of called Daniel Sutton. He was a country surgeon who made it his life's work to study every aspect of inoculation and try and make it simpler. So he'd look at different days to take the pus from the pustule, at different depths of the cut, for example. And he developed a system called Suetonian method, which involved just a kind of tiny scratch on the skin. Sound familiar? Turkish inoculation. A few pills of mercury and antimony to act as a laxative, a very, very short preparation period, and isolation. Okay, and this method, Suetonian method, became popularized and cheap for the general population in rural areas. Everyone would be kind of inoculated together, would isolate together in their village. And one of the people who became an inoculator was Jenner himself. Of course, he lived in a rural area in Gloucestershire. People worked with cows. And although he wasn't the first person to recognize the connection between having suffered from cowpox and the immune effect for smallpox, that was someone called John Fuster, another surgeon from the southwest. He was the person who really looked into it for, I think he first heard of cowpox in 1768, and in 1796 he did his famous experiment on James Phipps, his gardener's son, where he vaccinated James with someone who had pus from cowpox, a milkmaid called Sarah Nelms. And after vaccinating James Phipps with cowpox, he then inoculated him with smallpox, and he didn't get a reaction to that, hence the birth of vaccination. Now, the advantage of cowpox vaccination over inoculation is that cowpox is not contagious. It's not going to kill you. It's also doesn't give you lifelong immunity either. And the big problem with inoculation with smallpox is that you became contagious. Personally, you would benefit from it, but if you went out in your community, you could infect someone else. Without isolation, inoculation was never going to be for the urban poor in particular, and because of economic circumstances, it was very difficult to introduce it to the urban poor. So cowpox doesn't immediately become favoured over inoculation. Inoculation's been used for a generation at the point when Jenner introduces cowpox vaccination. A lot of people don't want to change from the system, they're used to it. But in 1840, inoculation is banned in favour of cowpox. Just to tell you what happened to Mary. Mary stuck around for 20 years or so to bring up her children and to help her sister, who had serious mental health problems, to be treated in a humane way. And then she ups and goes to live in Italy for the next 23 years. Now, her biographers generally say that she was chasing a younger man, a writer of science like herself, called Francesco Algaretti. Now, if that's the case, then good on her. She was half her age. But I think that Mary hoped to find more intellectual acceptance in Europe, in Italy, where women could actually go to university in some cases and write papers. I think that was an element as well that's not really discussed that much, I don't think. In terms of her relationship with her husband, he actually stood by her. He financially supported her. They never met again. They corresponded quite often about their son, Edward Wortley Montagu, and a fantastic photograph of him in his turban. He was a bit of an errant son, and he ended up actually going back to Turkey and converting to Islam. Mary lives in a village in Italy towards the end of her days, and they really celebrate her. They thought she was great. They wanted to put up a statue of her. They named streets after her, which has never happened in Britain. But in 1760, Edward, her husband, dies, and Mary decides to come back to England to meet the grandchildren she's never met before. She knows she's ill, she's got breast cancer, and she dies a year later. So how is Mary remembered? Well, I'm sad to say that when she died, she was buried without ceremony at all. Her daughter Mary had ended up marrying someone called John Stuart, who became the first Tory Prime Minister of Britain, and he was Prime Minister at the time that Mary had died. And daughter Mary didn't want any scandal coming from this. And so, yeah, buried without ceremony. She has a memorial in Lichfield Cathedral. And I don't know if you remember at the start of the COVID epidemic, Lichfield Cathedral was used as a vaccination centre. And I actually wrote to the Dean of Lichfield and said, can you point to your vaccinated people towards this memorial? Let them know it started with Mary. As soon as she died, her letters about her travels to Turkey were published and became an absolute sensation. But I'm sad to say that her daughter Mary, still embarrassed by her mother, burnt all of her diaries. They've all been lost to history. All we really have is some of her poems, writing, and her letters. And just last year, a new biography came out about Mary by Jo Willett, who I've met, who's fantastic. But she only has 5 biographies. Jenna has over 100. I know we're running out of time, so we all know that at the end point of this story, the World Health Organization in 1960 set out on a worldwide campaign to eradicate smallpox, which has killed 300 million people in the 20th century alone. This amazing social achievement leads to the eradication of smallpox in 1977. It's declared eradicated in 1980. So what is Mary's legacy? Well, I think with the interest in COVID, with it being the 300-year anniversary of inoculation last year, there was quite a lot of interest in the press. The Guardian had an article entitled, "Do you owe this woman your life?" To which I would say, yes. And in terms of what Mary was trying to achieve in terms of winning the war at last, don't think it's just about the eradication of smallpox. I think it's about people listening to clear-sighted individuals, people looking at the evidence in front of them and basing medical decisions on that. It's about the development of evidence-based medicine, and it's about women being accepted a scientist as well. And there's just a picture on the side of the front cover of Vaxxers, which is about by Dr. Sarah Gilbert and Catherine Green, who introduced the AstraZeneca vaccine. So that is the end of my presentation today. I hope you agree that Mary was a medical pioneer. She had lots of challenges that she had to face. She was frustrated in her lifetime, but yeah, she brought us preventative medicine. So that's Mary. Thank you very much.